Welcome to day 2 of the specific Aims Accelerator. We'll give everybody a few minutes to settle in, and I'll just give you some updated housekeeping as we get started. So the chat should be working today after our little glitch yesterday. So type any comments in the chat. Perhaps today we can learn where you're joining from. We do, of course, still have the Q&A box, which we'll use for questions this time. And just to give you a sense of the format for today, we're going to make sure that we get through today's lesson materials before we talk about any questions you might have had about yesterday's homework. And of course, anything that you have learned today, anything that you have questions about from the lesson today. So welcome everyone. Please let me know where you are joining from. Use that chat. I'd love to hear that. And I'm just going to pull up my slides in the meantime so that we can get started. Oh, the UK, excellent. Hi, Stacy. San Antonio, Texas, Orlando, Florida, Philly, Wilmington. Excellent. Great to see you all here today. St. Louis, Los Angeles, Cincinnati, Detroit. Oh my goodness, this is great to see. Baltimore, San Francisco. Great, everybody. I'm delighted to have you here once again. I'm just going to pull up my slides. Just give me a second to get a bit reorganized here. I think that is it. Give me a thumbs up if you can see the slides. All right, excellent. Okay. Good. So I'm going to go full screen here. Super. Okay, so we are on to day 2. Yesterday, we talked about sort of the overall strategy, the approach, why you want to start with your Aims page. Today, we're diving right in. Okay. So we are talking about the introduction, that first section of your Aims page. Today, you'll learn how to approach that opening section of your Aims page. You're going to learn the problem gap hook solution framework, and you're going to learn how to make sure that you're not asking your reviewer to read your mind, because I bet a lot of you are. Okay. So I want to remind you what we talked about yesterday in terms of the overall approach to your Aims page, right? We want to move from broad to specific because that's how we as humans absorb information in the most sort of logical way. So as we're doing this, we're moving most broadly from the significance and the context into the objectives and into the aims. And then at the end, we do kind of zoom out and tie it all together with our expected outcomes. So over the course of the rest of the week, we're going to be getting into each of these. But today we're starting with that top line, significance. So the broadest of the broad. And I hope by the end of today's lesson, you'll understand why it's so important to provide that context and to start as broadly as we do. But there is sort of a fine line. We don't want to go too broad. And this is one of the big mistakes that I see in a lot of Aims pages, a lot of introductions in the actual body of the grant, and of course, even in your papers. So the framework that you're going to learn today is going to help you for all of those things. It's really going to help you situate your work in a way that's also going to kind of get your readers as close to the action and as close to the excitement as possible. So let's also remember that you are dividing your Aims page into 4 sections. We're talking about significance, goals and objectives, aims and general approach, and outcomes and impact. All right. So let us begin. The goal for this introductory section is to give the reviewers the background to understand why your proposed research is important and impactful. So here's where we get into the problem gap hook solution framework. This is a rhetorical tool to frame your research so that it's memorable and exciting. And this framework is one that I have adapted from work that was originally put forward by Lorelei Lingard. Dr. Lingard developed the problem gap hook framework to describe really how to write papers, how to rhetorically frame your academic papers. And I have taken that framework and adapted it specifically to grant writing, so that we can understand the connections between different sections of a grant that you would write and how to sort of make the most of those different sections and how they talk to each other. Okay, so here's an overview of the framework. So first of all, you want to define a big scientific or clinical or population level problem or barrier or grand challenge. Then you want to identify a gap in current knowledge or thinking that's preventing or limiting progress. Then you want to describe a hook that convinces reviewers that this gap is important. In other words, what becomes possible when we fill this gap? And finally, you want to propose a solution that fills the gap and thereby sort of chips away at that broader problem. So what I want you to notice about this, first of all, is how kind of self-contained it is and how self-referential it is. And you'll see this as we move through the other sections of the Aims page, how you're always sort of calling back to sections that you have written previously or text that you've written previously. And that is by design, okay? The reason that we want to do that is because we want our readers to really absorb what we're telling them. And we do that through reinforcement and repetition, not always verbatim, but reinforcement of those concepts by sort of calling back to what we've written previously. And this framework helps us do that in a really clear and logical and persuasive way. Okay, so just a little more on each of those pieces of the framework. So when we're talking about the problem, here is where you're introducing a big, juicy, scientific, clinical, or population level problem or barrier or grand challenge that can't be solved with any one single research project, even an ambitious 5-year R01, okay? This is well beyond that. It goes beyond the project you're proposing, but the findings from your project will contribute to an eventual solution. And for the person yesterday who asked about how this relates to work that is more sort of fundamental or basic science, even within the broader context of biomedical research, I think that this still works really effectively when you're talking about a big scientific challenge, right? It's still something that you are working on that goes beyond this one project, but you're talking about the scientific challenge and what you're trying to figure out or what you're trying to discover. So this framework still works really effectively when we're not framing it in terms of a clinical challenge or a health issue. And this is one of the areas where people get really tripped up, because what they often do in introducing their work is they frame it in terms of the topic and not the problem. And I think that's what we were, or what that person who was asking that question yesterday was really referring to, is the way that we typically frame the work in terms of the topic rather than the scientific or clinical or population level challenge. We talk about it in terms of the disease burden and the cost to the healthcare system. But usually that type of information at the beginning of a grant or a paper is not actually relevant to the problem you're trying to solve. You're really introducing the topic, and sometimes that's necessary to provide adequate context, but more often than not, you can just dive right in to what the problem is. And the way that you tell the difference is by figuring out who you're speaking to, who your audience is. Okay, and the reason that you want to figure that out is you want to sort of assess their level of knowledge or familiarity with the topic already. Because if you're just telling them stuff that they already know, you're wasting space. You're wasting really valuable real estate on a one-pager. Okay. So some words of wisdom here. Again, there's a difference between the scientific problem and the topic area, and do not confuse them. So here's an example for you. The topic area of your work may be multiple sclerosis, but the scientific problem is figuring out how to identify neurodegeneration before it becomes symptomatic. So you see the difference? There's that sort of big umbrella topic, but within that, there are, a bunch of grand scientific challenges that you need to figure out, and you're sort of focusing in on one of them. And even within that, there's a lot to untangle, right? So we don't want to go too broad when we're talking about the topic. And so that's why we focus on identifying that problem. Okay, next we have the gap. So next you need to explain why there's a scientific problem or a barrier to progress. Typically, this is a gap in knowledge. So we don't know enough about X, right? Or it could also be a gap, or instead, alternatively, it could be a gap in thinking. So we've been thinking about X all wrong. That one can be a little bit more delicate, especially if you're early in your career. Yesterday we talked a little bit about, paradigm shifting and how to talk about introducing sort of new ways of thinking about something to an audience. And in the same way, you want to be really careful about how you describe a gap in thinking, because typically the people who've thought a certain way about a problem are the ones, or at least some of them will be the ones who are actually sitting there reviewing your grant. So you always want to be sort of judicious about how you approach this. And I will say that more often than not, in the types of grants that I see, it's a gap in knowledge, but not always. Sometimes it is a gap in thinking. And it's just really important to sort of figure out which one of those you're dealing with. But the other piece to know here is that it's usually really helpful to describe what we already know about the problem before describing what we don't yet know. And that is, of course, the gap, right? So if we're talking about what we already know, that's drawing on that conversation in the literature that we talked about yesterday, right? Some words of wisdom here. So there is probably lots we don't know about that big scientific problem, right? But it's not your job to describe all of the things that we don't know. Your job is to direct focus to the gap that you are trying to fill in this proposal. And that's really important. Again, on your Aims page, you have very limited real estate. And so you need to be really selective about how you describe what we know and what we don't know, so that it leads kind of obviously to your gap, and then the hook, and then your solution, right? So you want all of those things to sort of filter down. All right, now let's talk about the hook. This one is really tricky for a lot of people, and I'll explain why that is. But first, let's talk about what the hook actually is. So you need to give a compelling reason why the gap must be filled. So what are the stakes? So for example, what becomes possible when we fill the gap that is not possible now? How will filling the gap allow the field to move forward? Why is now the time to fill the gap? What has changed or shifted so that filling the gap is now possible? Why might a new approach work now when it didn't before? Or, and this one I would use only in case of emergency, what are the consequences of not filling the gap? So just show of hands, how many people have ever used in a grant application the phrase, there is a critical need for? Raise your hand. Okay, yep, let's all be honest about that. Yeah, so it is a lot more convincing to explain why there is a critical gap than to just say there's a critical need, right? It is truly a lot more compelling, a lot more convincing to lay it out in terms of the problem gap hook that we have just gone through here. It's so much more compelling to do it that way than to say, therefore, there is a critical need for us to do X, Y, Z, right? Because what you're doing in that case is you are just asking reviewers to trust you. You're saying, like, trust me, there's a critical need here. We just need to do this. But if you lay it out and contextualize it in terms of that big picture problem, the gap that you're trying to fill, and then what becomes possible when you fill that gap, That's exactly what you are doing when you're telling them there's a critical need. You are laying it out, you are explaining it. And that is so much more convincing than saying, trust me, there's a critical need. So this is the alternative to that. And it's a much more compelling and persuasive alternative, okay? So here's why people have a hard time with the hook. So most applicants don't actually include a hook because they think it's obvious or self-evident why the research ought to be done, right? And it makes sense because if you are really invested in this work, if you've been immersed in it for a really long time, it is clear to you why we need to do this, why it's important to follow this line of inquiry, why it's important to actually do this work. But it might not be clear to the people who are reading your grant. And so you need to really spell it out for them. You need to connect those dots for them, make it as easy as possible for them to get on board with what you're trying to do. And the way that you do that is by tying it all together and saying, here's what becomes possible when we fill this gap in knowledge. And oh, by the way, we have a plan to fill that gap in knowledge. That's the solution, that comes later. But by laying out the big picture problem that your gap is kind of situated within, and then really describing kind of what we know about the problem and what we don't know, which is the gap that you're trying to fill. And then saying, here's what becomes possible when we fill this gap in knowledge, that is going to help your reviewers really understand the context of what you're doing and really set the stage for the solution that you are providing. And that's when we get into, your objectives and aims, which we're going to be talking about later this week. But this really sets the stage for that. And it gets them really excited for what you are proposing to do because you've made it very clear why this research matters. That's what the first paragraph is really about, that first section. Okay. So the first section of your Aims page should cover the problem and the gap and the hook because you want to provide enough context for your research idea, the solution, right? So just to underline that point. Okay, that is, as I've said before, these lessons are designed to be short because the meat is really in the implementation. So that is a very brief lesson on problem, gap, hook. And now we can get to questions about yesterday's homework. And of course, any questions that you have about today's lesson. I know that that's a lot to absorb. It's like drinking from a fire hose. So we can go back through and answer any specifics about the framework. But if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will get to them. So I'm just gonna stop sharing for a second here. Okay, so I'm a bit confused by the terms scientific problem, barrier, gap. What are the differences? Isn't the problem also the gap barrier? No. So the difference between the gap and the barrier is so let's go back to the beginning. So the problem that you are trying to solve goes beyond any one single grant, whether that's a 5-year R01 or a 2-year R03 or R23. This is the big problem that like a lot of different people are working on. And you are using this problem to sort of contextualize the gap in knowledge that you are trying to fill. You're sort of demonstrating that you are on a trajectory as a researcher and you're moving towards solving this much larger problem. Your research isn't just kind of flash in the pan like, ooh, this looks cool, let's try this. It's because you're building towards something, right? And so you want to explain what it is that you are building towards. That's really what the problem is. The gap is more specific than that. It is what you are proposing to fill in this actual project that you're proposing, right? In this grant proposal, you are proposing to fill a specific gap in knowledge. And so that gap in knowledge kind of falls under this broader umbrella of the problem that you've described. It's kind of the next step in solving this larger problem. And once you've filled that gap, there's going to be another one right after it, and then you're going to fill that one. And by filling these series or constellation of gaps, you're eventually going to contribute to solving this much bigger problem. So that's the difference between the problem and the gap. Elizabeth asks, what would the solution to a gap in thinking necessarily be a new theoretical or methodological approach? Yes. So that's kind of the difference, right? A gap in knowledge is, we don't understand really how this works. But a gap in thinking is like, we've been thinking about this all wrong. We've been going about this in a way that is inadequate, just, for example, right? And so what you would be proposing as a solution is a new way of thinking about this. And again, that can get a little bit dicey, especially, early in your career, to come in and say, like, listen, we've been doing this all wrong. We've been thinking about this all wrong. It's definitely still possible. You have to really be able to finesse that. But it definitely is present in biomedical research, that we need to revisit ways that we've been thinking about things and propose alternatives. Yeah. Do I provide consulting sessions? Yes. Yes, I do run a business supporting early career researchers to get funded. We have different ways of working with people. We have a self-paced course that walks you through exactly how to write a full R01 step by step. We have programs for women faculty who are at that transition point between their career development award and getting their first R01, and how to go about doing that successfully. And then we have one-on-one editing services for people who have submitted R01s previously that were scored but not fundable, and we help them get funded on the next go. So those are the ways that we work with folks. I'm happy to tell you more about that later on, but yeah, that's what we do here. Jessica asks, how much space are we dedicated to each of these parts of the framework in the paragraph? So good question. And this is one of those ones that it's always going to depend, right? It's going to depend on the context of your research. But I would say kind of maximum 1 or 2 sentences for each of those. You really want to keep it kind of as punchy and concise as possible, but sometimes you are going to need to take a little more space to explain things, especially if there are kind of a lot of moving parts in your grant. And so my best advice there is to be as concise as possible, and to keep everything as close to just as relevant as possible to the problem and the gap and the hook that you are describing. And again, it's not going to be perfect the first time you try it, of course. Just give yourself that leeway right now. It's not going to be perfect the first time you try, but just getting your ideas down when it comes to what you think the problem is, what the gap is, and what the hook is. You just start there and then refine. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the Q&A box here. Lily asks, when you talk about past research, how do you avoid being criticized for not being innovative? Should one leave out research that's very similar but not exactly to what you're proposing? So this is a question about the innovation of your research, and we're going to do our best to stay focused on the Aims page. We don't really get into a ton of discussion about innovation in the Aims page, Lily, and so I'm just going to say that is something to deal with in the full application and not on the Aims page, okay? Like I said, I do have an entire course that teaches you how to handle the innovation section and all of the other sections in the application. But right now we are focused on the Aims page, and at most you would have like a single sentence about innovation in your Aims page. Can we go over the first paragraph of the homework of some participants who've tried to write this section? So unfortunately, we don't, in this Accelerator, we're not reviewing and providing feedback on anyone's homework. But if you have any questions about your homework, I'm happy to answer them. Nancy says, are there any differences in a problem gap hook strategy for proposals focused on methods development versus knowledge contribution / hypothesis testing? So great question, Nancy. I would say, again, if you're looking at, like, how would you describe the problem, right? So what is the problem that you are trying to solve with the methods development, or what is, let me back up a second. So what is the gap that you are trying to fill with the methods development, and how is that situated within a larger problem, right? So you can still definitely use the framework for these types of applications, but you want to think about the gap and the problem and the hook, what becomes possible when we develop and use this this new method as compared to the current gold standard. You do want to think about it in terms of how those things relate to each other, right? It's about maintaining that sort of internal thread and sort of self-referential nature of what you're doing. And of course, the gap and the problem are going to look slightly different than they would in a sort of knowledge contribution / hypothesis testing, but it is still definitely possible to frame it in terms of a wider problem that you are working on solving, and then a specific gap that you are trying to fill by developing new methods. Erica asks, how do you recommend stepping through setting up a problem if you are building new technologies to address a novel biological problem? For example, I develop new engineering tools to detect a novel cancer biomarker for monitoring, and it always feels like I'm providing either way too much or too little detail. Yeah, and I know for all the engineers out there, I know this one is really tricky because a lot of the times, and this is, we've worked with plenty of engineers before, and one of the really tricky things is that the problem and the gap are really about, like, I'm going to prove that this works, right? I'm going to build this thing and I'm going to prove that it works. And so it does get a little tricky in terms of how to frame it in that way. But again, if you are talking about the novel biological problem, you have the problem already, and you want to talk about the tool, not necessarily in terms of the tool itself, but what the tool is going to allow you to do, right? And so in your case, if you're trying to detect a novel cancer biomarker for monitoring, you would, well, especially depending on the audience of reviewers, you would focus less on the development of the tool itself, or the optimization of the tool itself, in terms of how you frame your project, and you would talk more about what the successful optimization of the tool is going to allow you to do, right? So it's going to allow you to detect a novel cancer biomarker that you're going to be able to use for monitoring. And so that's you would talk about the gap in terms of, why can't we currently monitor this? What are the issues with monitoring right now? What do we know about how we can monitor this this cancer, and what don't we know? And then you can talk about the necessity of developing some type of tool that's going to allow us to monitor longitudinally. And then when you're describing your solution, you're going to say, well, here's, we are developing this tool and we're going to optimize it here. But you can absolutely still frame that in terms of, the broader problem. And then the gap in knowledge, which is about, not having an adequate tool to monitor or to detect this biomarker for monitoring purposes. Kim asks, do you think other gaps in solutions need to be acknowledged before telling the reviewers, yet we are taking this approach? Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a bit hard without specific context to answer that, Kim, but I think the better approach is to not distract your reviewers by telling them like what else is going on when everybody is trying to solve this larger problem. Like you want to keep their blinders on in terms of like, here's what we're talking about here. This is the problem that we're trying to solve, and here's the specific gap in knowledge that we are trying to fill, and here's what we know about this gap, and here's how we propose to fill this gap. So if it's around the same gap, yes, by all means, you're going to have to acknowledge what other people have done and what has worked and what hasn't worked. But you don't want to distract them by saying, oh yeah, we know that there are these other gaps, but we're not talking about those. We're talking about this gap. I do understand that can be a little bit tricky, but you do really want to keep them super, super focused. And part of that is just how you set up kind of talking about the problem and what we know about the problem, right? So yeah, just do your best to keep them as focused as possible, and to keep their eyes on a single gap. Is the proposed solution part of the first paragraph of the aims, or should it be included in the second paragraph? Great question. So this is more about what, so the short answer is no, you don't include the solution in the first paragraph. You're sort of setting them up to expect a solution that's going to address everything that you talk about in the first paragraph. So you do get into it into the second and third paragraphs when you're talking about your project objective and the actual aims you're going to use to achieve that objective. But in that first paragraph, you're just giving them the lay of the land. You're saying, here's this big juicy problem that we're trying to solve, or here's this, grand scientific challenge that we're working on. Here's the gap that we are focused on. Here's what we know about it. Here's what we don't yet know. And here's why filling this gap matters. And that's the first paragraph. And that is sort of setting them up to expect that when you do talk about the solution, that it's going to be related to those things that you talked about in that first paragraph. Yeah. Any other questions? You're welcome, Erica. Sarah, I will provide some more information about our programs later in the week. But all of that information is available on my website. If you do want to go take a look there, there's lots of information on the website, but I'll tell you a little bit about that later in the week. I want you all to stay laser focused on your Aims page. So yeah, happy to do that a bit later on. I'm going to pull up my slides again to show you what homework is for this week. Oh, thanks for posting the website. Actually, Lindsay, I think that just went to the host and the panelists. So if you can make sure that that goes out to everybody, that would be super helpful. Okay. We have another question here. In some grants, people briefly mention their expertise by referring to previous papers. Yeah, so this is definitely something that you can do very strategically in different parts of your application. I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, if you have a really big paper that sets up some of your supporting evidence, you're going to want to include that in this second section that we're going to go through tomorrow. But you also want to put it in some other key strategic spots in your full application. And again, that's sort of beyond the scope of what we're talking about in the accelerator this week. But absolutely, if you have big papers that you want to talk about, and then you can use to provide that supporting evidence for either the feasibility of your project or the scientific premise of it, you absolutely want to put that in key parts of your application for sure. Okay, I am going to pull up my slides again so that you can see what we have coming up homework wise. And again, so we will be sending out, there was a bit of a glitch yesterday. We were not able to send out your notification that yesterday's lesson was up in the course area. It is now. It's also published in your podcast feed. So for those of you who are subscribed to the private podcast feed, it's there for you already. We will have this out for you today, probably within sort of 90 minutes of the time that we end today's session. And we will remind you of your homework there, but just so you have it here, you want to write that introductory section of your Aims page using the problem gap hook of the problem gap hook framework. And that you can find in your workbook. There's a really sort of nice walkthrough of how to do that in your workbook. And then another thing that will be really helpful for you is if you can find an example of a successful Aims page and see if you can identify the problem and the gap in the hook. It might not be there unless they worked with me. It might not actually be there, but in most successful Aims pages, you will have that context, and you will have an identification of a clear gap. The one thing you may not have clearly delineated is a hook, but see if you can find those different pieces in a successful Aims page from your own subject matter area. That's going to be the most useful for you. And for extra credit, we do actually have inside our free resource library, we do have an over-the-shoulder Aims page review that I did of someone who volunteered to show us their Aims page. And so if you want to look at that, if you're already a member of the free resource library, it's in there for you. It's under the specific Aims lesson. If you're not a member of the free resource library, make sure you go sign up for that, because there's a lot of stuff in there, not just the over-the-shoulder Aims page. But that's going to be really useful for you to see kind of how I handle particularly the problem gap hook in that first section. But you can also, if you want, I really do want you to follow the structure this week to just really stay focused, but I know some of you really want to skip ahead and figure out all the other parts. So you can do a bit of skipping ahead by going and watching this over-the-shoulder Aims page review that's in the resource library. But that's sort of the extra credit there. So that's what your homework is for today. So write that first section. And see if you can find a specific Aims page sample from a colleague, and see if you can identify the problem and the gap in the hook in that Aims page. So here's what we're going to do tomorrow. So tomorrow we're going to cover how to write your goals and objectives. So that's that second section. Of course, we'll talk about the distinction between goals and objectives. And we're also going to talk about how to make sure you're connecting the dots for your reviewers in a way that matters to them. You're not trying to prove how smart you are. Okay, that's a really easy pit to fall into, especially when you're fairly early in your career. It's just like wanting to show that you've done the reading, wanting to show that you've done the work. And we're going to talk about how to avoid that tomorrow, while still, demonstrating your expertise and experience with the grant that you're proposing. So that's what's on for tomorrow. I'm going to check the questions again. Yeah, so I do know that previously the recording had a bit of a glitch in it and you couldn't see the changes, but we've updated that. So the new over the shoulder Aims page is properly updated. You can now see the changes that I made. So I apologize for the delay on that. It was just one of those things that that I couldn't get to until I could get to it, and it's up there now. So when you go and watch the over the shoulder Aims page review, you'll be able to see those changes and not just hear me talking about them. Yeah. What do you think of stating the solution first, then commenting why filling the gap hook is important? Yes, so great question. And this is something I do see in some Aims pages, is people starting with the solution, with the objective of their proposal, and then going through. I personally don't like that approach. I don't find it to be beneficial in the long run, because I find it quite disorienting, actually, to read what an objective is before I have any context for why that objective is important. So remember what I said before about moving from broad to specific. That provides that context and that orientation for your reader, so that by the time you get to the solution, they're like, oh yeah, of course you would be doing it this way. It's like, giving somebody directions without actually, or sending somebody to a destination without actually giving them any directions. It doesn't help, in my opinion. So, I mean, if, I'm sure it's worked for people, and it does show up on examples of successful Aims pages, but for me personally, it's a lot clearer and more logical to provide that context first and explain the why before you explain the what and the how. That is I guess I would say it's a personal preference, but it's also the approach that we've taken with the hundreds of grants that we have reviewed over the years quite successfully. So it's not just a personal preference, it's an effective method to orient your readers to the work that you're doing and really get them on board kind of at each level of detail that you're providing. You're making sure that they really understand before you move on to the next level. And like I said, starting out with the objective or the solution when you don't understand what the problem is you're going to have to go back to the beginning anyway, so you might as well just put it in what I would consider to be the logical place. Shilpa asks, as part of solution, do you provide a brief premise, preliminary data on which your hypothesis or proposed solution is based? Why, yes, you do. And that's exactly what we're going to be getting into tomorrow. So yeah, so section 2 is really goals, objectives, supporting evidence. So don't worry, we're going to cover that. You're getting a little bit ahead of what we're doing, but yes, absolutely. You definitely want to talk about, how you arrived at your research question, how you arrived at your general hypothesis, and we're going to talk about how to do that tomorrow. Okay. Good. Any other questions? I did promise you we would try to keep this to 45 minutes so that you could go off and do your homework. And we are just right about there. So I'm happy to answer more questions if there are more questions, but I do want to give you time to go off and do your homework. And I know in some ways the problem gap hook seems quite simple, but do not be deceived. It actually takes a ton of practice to really grasp that framework. And like I said, you're not going to get it right the first time. Give yourself that grace to know that you're not, it's not going to come naturally the first time. It does take practice. It does take iteration. But it's really worth giving it a try, because using this framework can really help you sort out your thinking. It can really help you sort of figure out what it is that you are actually doing and why your research matters, by thinking about sort of the broader problem, the gap that you're trying to fill, and why filling that gap matters. So give it a try. Come back tomorrow and tell me all the reasons that it worked and didn't work, and we'll talk about it. But yeah, definitely give it a shot. Okay, we do have one more question. In describing the gap, is it appropriate to emphasize the paucity of research on a problem related to an ethnic group and the aggregation of data within a racial group? So it's hard to know without the specifics of your project. But generally speaking, I do not recommend focusing your gap on just the lack of research in and of itself. You want to connect that lack of research or lack of data to like the sort of the consequence of that lack of data, right? You want to make it clear why, why having this data is really, really important. Right. So just saying, the gap is that we've never done this type of research before, or nobody's done this very specific type of study before. That in and of itself is not a very compelling gap. But if you're saying, we don't have, the crucial information that we need to be able to blank, that is much more compelling, and that will make a much stronger case for the ultimate solution that you're providing, which is that project. But don't make that circular argument around like nobody's done this type of research before, and oh, hey, guess what? Look what we're doing. Turns out that we're doing that exact type of project. That just comes across as a little bit sleazy. And you always want to make sure that you're connecting it to a broader sort of consequence of like, first of all, why don't we have that data? Why don't we have that evidence? And why does it matter that we have it, right? So you definitely want to make that connection so that it's clear to your reviewers why it's important to actually go out and do that. So yeah, so that's, again, without understanding the context of your specific project, it's hard to give you recommendations there, but I would say that you definitely want to connect the lack of research or the lack of evidence to the consequences of that lack of evidence, and that's going to strengthen that argument for you. Okay, anything else before we wrap up today? Well, great to have you all here again. Can't wait to see you tomorrow and hear how it went for you with the problem, gap, and hook. And yeah, we will be back here tomorrow, same time, same place. See you then.